time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works in Korean and in English translations as well. This week it is the turn of cultural essayist Colin Marshall, host of the podcast 콜리나 한국 and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지, to join us in the studio. Colin, hello, it's great to see you again.
Thank you, Jang-ho. Glad to be here.
I see that you've brought two books into the studio for us today, one in Korean and one in English. Can you tell us more?
I have indeed brought two books. In fact, they're two versions of the same book. As regular listeners may recall, I usually come in to discuss works that have only been published in Korean, not yet translated elsewhere. But today is a special case. This is a novel whose Korean and English editions were published simultaneously in this country. In fact, the English is the original work, and the Korean is the translation. It's a novel called Haetae by the American writer Joe Menosky.
Okay, so our listeners may be thinking why we are introducing a book in English by an American writer, but that title gives us a clue, I think, because Haetae, they are the stone creatures standing guard in front of the gates of Gyeongbokgung Palace, right?
The very same. That's where anybody would have seen them. And if you think about it, you'll probably realize that you've seen them represented elsewhere in the city, too.
Sure.
Not just statues and sculptures. There are a few of those, but on the side of quite a few taxicabs, orange taxicabs as well. You know, a visitor to Seoul might well wonder what on earth these things are they're seeing everywhere. And in fact, the roots of Haetae go back to Chinese mythology, which describes the sheji as a four-legged animal with great intelligence, as well as a single horn on its head, used to administer justice of a rough variety to corrupt magistrates.
Okay, so that sounds not unlike the Haetae we know in Korea, but they do a somewhat different job here, don't they?
They do, and what they keep in check in Korea is not the excesses of humanity, of administration, but the forces of nature, specifically the element of fire. That's why we see Haetae represented in effigy at an important building like Gyeongbokgung, because they're meant to ward off fire, and they have been since the Joseon period. Now, only in 2008, very recently, was a Haetae, or rather Haechi, to use the proper name of this particular character, officially made the mascot of Seoul. You may have seen just this year, the city introduced a new Haechi design, making him cuddlier and pinker, much pinker. But if you look at their origins, these are pretty fearsome beasts.
Okay, so the fact that this book is about these very Korean mythological beasts and the fact that it was published simultaneously with a Korean translation is what caught our attention and why we're covering it today. Now, looking at the cover of both books, the Haetae in the cover of this novel is neither pink nor particularly cuddly, so I take it that the author has gone with a more classical interpretation of the legend.
He has, though he sets the action here in the 21st century. He casts the Haetae not as Seoul's promoter, but its protector, the eater of the fire that would burn down its buildings. And he envisions a reality where Haetae are not just mythical, but real. Or rather, he envisions a reality where all mythical beings are real, not just Korean ones. But they exist on another plane of reality, one only accessible to a select few, including this novel's protagonist, 25-year-old Wendy Lee, who finds herself brought into the ranks of Club H, a small clandestine organization that works with the Haetae to defend Seoul from existential threats, fire and otherwise.
Wow, okay, so that sounds like a bit like a superhero team of the kind of we've seen in comic books and movies in recent years.
Very many in recent years, and you've probably encountered the notion that superhero stories are the myths of our time. And I suspect that Menosky accepts some version of that, given how naturally it seems to come to him, to weave a variety of folkloric threads together into a superheroic narrative, if you like. And in the person of Wendy Lee, we also have an example of a hugely popular convention in storytelling, that of the young main character plucked out of an unenviable low-status life by virtue of a special but hidden ability, and elevated into a separate realm of, as they say, both great power and great responsibility. Harry Potter would be a particularly successful example of that in recent cultural history.
Sure, and many other superhero films as well, I would say. So this is something familiar, but I guess the twist is that it brings in Korean myths and culture. So going back to the character of Wendy, what sort of powers does she have? What is her story about?
She eats fire, just like Haetae. And because of that, fire itself responds to her very presence, as if shrinking in fear. It's scared of her. And Menosky illustrates this almost at the very beginning of the novel, in a flashback, where the infant Wendy is trapped in a Sochon apartment building inferno. And by the time a firefighter manages to reach her, the elevator and stairways are filled with flames. Just as everything looks hopeless, Wendy's inner Haetae is summoned, and she consumes the fire, not the other way around. From then on, as the adult Windy tells it, she began sleepwalking to the locations of other fires before those fires started. That's the signal ability of a Club H member, and the one that gets Club H to find her, to track her down and bring her into their fold.
Okay, and as you said, that's the secret group whose members commune with the Haetae and defend Seoul from fires. Who else is in it?
There's Poet Jun, PJ Kwon, Hungry Gal No, Kid Ki, Admin Yoon, and the chauffeur-driver Park, or in the Korean version, Dongju, Bomjun, Yangmi, Ilso, and Pak Kisa, all of whom live together in this elaborate Hanok complex, hidden away from the rest of the city. It really is a lot like the living situation of a classic superhero team. And as made explicit in the book, and even more emphasized in the Korean than in English, Club H also becomes a new family for Windy, whose mother has died in the fire I mentioned, and whose inattentive father has gone off and married someone else.
So it's clear that this book has plenty of heroes, but a story of this kind must have a few villains as well, I'm guessing. Who are the antagonists then, apart from the fire itself?
The latest wave of fires to which Club H is responding are breaking out across Seoul, or Korea, as a matter of fact, in what looks like a deliberate arrangement, one corresponding to the patterns of a gut, or a Korean shamanistic ritual. And this is where Menosky brings in the tradition of Korean shamanism, known as musok, with the character of Manchin Mehwa, a manchin being the kind of shaman or musok who's meant to be wholly possessed by spirits during these rituals. And things start to look more sinister when it emerges that Manchin Mehwa is in the employ of the Titanus Corporation, the builders of an ominously colossal skyscraper in Seoul called the Tower of Olympus.
The Tower of Olympus. Obviously, that refers to Greek mythology.
Indeed.
You mentioned earlier how this is a story where all mythical beings are real and not just Korean ones. So is this where other mythical beings come into play? That name can hardly be a coincidence, I feel.
It's a big hint about things to come in this story, and that the scope might be wider than we initially expect. As I say, Menosky opens the door between not just reality and Korean myth, but reality and all myth. And in the introduction, he refers to the work of a French scholar named Henry Corbett, who posited something called the imaginal world, which Menosky describes as a realm that is both created by human imagination and simultaneously exists independently of it. He claims that all figures of mythology and folktale and legend, therefore, exist in this space, halfway between matter and thought, Santa Claus included.
Santa Claus. So you're saying Father Christmas makes an appearance in the story as well?
I'm afraid not, but he gave the example. I took it straight from Joe Menosky. But from what I've heard, if you trace the conception of Santa Claus back to its origins, you end up in Finland. And Menosky does include a Finnish character, a folklorist named Matthias Halko, who comes to Seoul practically the moment he reads speculations online that the series of fires in Korea could have something to do with the Haetae. And in a way, Halko is a kind of satire of the academic who abandons objectivity in order to try to prove the truth of his own beliefs. And for reasons of his own, Halko believes that the mythical beings and realms of his own culture and other cultures are real. And he's willing to go across the world for even the slightest chance of evidence.
Okay, that's interesting. So a Finnish character comes in. I guess it's an easy way to see why a character like him would be useful to the story, seeing as he's an outsider who can perhaps stand in for the non-Korean reader who won't necessarily be well-versed in Korean folklore, and at the same time, as an expert in the field of folklore per se, he can also explain concepts that readers won't know. That imaginal realm you mentioned, for example.
Exactly, yes. I suspect some foreign readers will also see a bit of themselves in Matthias Halko, in that he becomes enamored of Korea from the moment he arrives here. And as a foreigner who came to live in Seoul not long after my own first visit, I can certainly understand that, though unlike him, I didn't spend my first night here on the floor of a restaurant after binge-drinking makgeolli. It wouldn't surprise me if Menosky put something of himself into this character as well, seeing as he too seems to have been consumed by this fascination with Korean culture. In fact, Haetae is his second novel. His first, King Sejong the Great, was about the achievements of that much celebrated 15th century ruler, a figure who captured Menosky's imagination just as soon as he learned of him.
Right, so I was curious about that. So this is not his first foray into writing about Korean culture then. Can you tell us more about Menosky? Was his first book also published simultaneously in English and Korean as well? Because I could see how an American novelist taking on the subject of King Sejong would draw a lot of attention here in Korea.
It certainly did, and it was published the same way, English and Korean at the same time, here in Korea, both published here. And the book, King Sejong the Great, had an unusual origin story. Only a few years ago did Joe Menosky turn novelist. Before that, he'd spent decades as a television writer in Hollywood. He's still there today, contributing most prolifically to Star Trek The Next Generation, which originally ran in the late 80s and early 90s, very popular Star Trek show. When he started thinking about King Sejong, his first idea was naturally to write a television series about his life. So he wrote this TV script, and that caught the eye of a Korean publisher, who requested that he convert it into a novel. So King Sejong the Great and Haetae, both books, share what you might call a highly visual prose style. At times, reading it, you almost feel like you're watching the film or television adaptation, like it's playing in front of you, in your head.
Right, so interesting. So I'm curious, it sounds like a fun story and a fun concept. Does it sound authentic, though? I think a lot of listeners would be wondering. Does it sound like someone who genuinely understands and appreciates Korean culture and not just an outsider looking at the surface details?
It's a fair concern.
Do the books work for perhaps a Korean audience?
I think when you read the English one, you feel like, oh, it's an American style of storytelling. It is informed by the methods of Western television, Western storytelling, popular storytelling. But you can sense the interest is there. He's done his homework not just about Korean mythology, but as I say, all mythology, and he weaves them together well. I personally couldn't find anything that seemed to me off. A Korean reader may feel differently. But in the Korean translation, if you read that, it feels like a Korean novel in many ways.
Right, okay.
Nothing stands out and thinks, everybody has read a Western book that makes big mistakes about Korea. But I didn't find anything like that in Haetae.
Right, so you have that rare ability to appreciate both the English and Korean translation. I understand that you've read both and you've compared both. So you're saying the Korean version works just as well then?
I think so, and in some ways the Korean translation by Park San-ho reads more smoothly, or in any case more like a traditional novel than the English version. To a degree that difference is one you would expect, since Menosky is a TV writer, expert in the art of delivering as full an impression as possible in a line or two. And Park San-ho is a literary translator and novelist herself who is used to having more space in which to expand. And she also has the task, not always easy, of translating for Korean readers a prose that in the original takes the occasional characteristically Western idiomatic turn. When I read one character use the expression cheap at half the price, which is somewhat confusing and contradictory even for native speakers, but it's just something we're used to saying and hearing. I had to stop right there and see how it appeared in the Korean. And sure enough, the translator simply excised it. So there are differences in the expressions and the general language, not just what language it's in.
Of course, and that does happen quite often in translations, whether it's novels or film subtitles or things like that.
That's true.
Okay, well, whether in English or Korean, Haetae sounds like a novel with a good deal of action, humour, and perhaps even scholarly interest for some. I've never heard of a book mixing cultural currents in quite this way.
And we haven't even got into how the story brings in not just Prometheus, who in Greek myth stole fire from the gods and brought it down to humanity, but the Greek gods themselves, like Zeus, Apollo, Hermes, Athena, Aphrodite.
Wow.
All of whom take Korean human form. The better to cause trouble. Here in modern-day Korea, Zeus Lee, that sort of those kind of names. As evidenced by this book, Joe Menosky, obviously, as I say, has a strong interest in an appreciation for mythology and Korea as well. And he's sufficiently steeped in it to know full well that whether we're dealing with the residents of Mount Olympus or a fire-eating Haetae, it's up to humanity to make them do good, not bad.
Well, it sounds like quite the adventure for both readers in English and Korean. Once again, it's called Haetae by Joe Menosky, and that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, thank you for that review once again. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.
Thank you very much, Sang-ho.
And that's where we wrap up our show today. Thank you for staying with us. Do join us again tomorrow for more news, views and reviews from Korea. Till then, we hope you have a wonderful day. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.